I lost my father to cancer when I was 21. And one of the most interesting things about that experience was seeing how everyone coped very differently. For me, it was, I didn't cry for months. I just felt numb to it. When it finally hit, it was a disaster, but a lot of people thought I just didn't care. And in reality, I had to cope the way I coped. For some of my family, it was shutting down completely, not functioning. My mom drove herself into work, just non-stop workaholic. Sometimes it's easier to cope with grief when you just avoid it. And at the time, I was luckily familiar enough. My dad was an undertaker and then a manager, and then I started working in them myself. You get very used to grief coming in many different forms, and people's final wishes also coming in many drastic different forms. And it's almost odd how you become less and less scared of it the more you're around it, but more respectful and appreciative of the beauty that comes in temporary. We're all stories in one form or another, not just our characters. But I find that part of making a character impactful to not just your world story, but the table and the player's stories is making sure that you treat that death with just as much respect as any other one. Now, this video is not for people in meat grinding campaigns that simply don't care for character death. These are for the story-driven DMs and their players on how to respect the passing of a character. And hopefully I can give you some of the knowledge that I've learned along the way from my life experiences and my experience as a DM. Now, first and foremost is preparation. Preparation is a lot of work on you and with your players. And the first part of that is making death matter. That is going to be different for each individual table. For some, it is going to be making sure death is an ever-looming threat. For me, death matters because it's not always on their radar. They're coming to love their characters just like we would Steve in Stranger Things. And as they grow in their journeys, I'm watching each and every one of the choices that they make to see where their weaknesses are, where their strengths are, and where they continue to make the wrong choices again and again. Eventually, one of those wrong choices are going to be picked at, and we'll see if they can recover. But I give my players every way that they can to survive and overcome death. That's not to say that people do not die at my table. That's to say that I don't find death meaningful when it is the DM misbalanced something. Well, it is what it is. I find death meaningful when my players say, I should have done better. I could have done this. I could have done this. And they made the bad choices and mistakes that failed their character. And the rare times where a player might be so invested into what their character would feel they need to do that they choose to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the party. Having that emotional investment and attachment, that is how I make death matter. You might make it different at your table, but this is what works for me. The next important part is having a backup character. For some people, a backup character is a way of saying, well, our main character doesn't matter. But to me, I find that having a backup character is like having family there to grieve with you. It is the incentive to go on. It is the hopes and the dreams that when that day comes, that their main character passes away, they have a reason to return to the table. I find that key aspect of having that plan not out of grief, but out of excitement, helps players to process that sorrow when the time does come. It is not something that I demand or need from my players. It is something that I highly suggest and encourage them to do. But it is an important part, in my opinion, to keeping the table together. And the last part of prep is whenever you have a new character join your table for a long-run campaign, plan out how you're going to handle their death based on their character and the player long before that threat ever comes. For example, one of our characters, Lejeron, decided to sacrifice himself. It was very emotional, and not even the player knew that that's where things were going to go that night. They were just as shocked as the rest of us and very emotional. Not only would that player have not really wanted that specific character to be the center of attention for anything, let alone that moment, that character would have never wanted his friends to see him weak. For Lejeune, his death was and always would be a quiet one, a simple one, but with ripples throughout the world. He would butterfly affect a lot of other things, and how to handle his death was in the moment, letting it go, but making sure that it took root in the entire world. When we lost Lejeune, it wasn't in a battle. He was seeing his friends off. We all knew, as both characters, players, and DM, that was going to be the last time he was ever seen. But instead of making some big ordeal or funeral, the characters watched their friend waving to them from the beach until they lost sight. He sent them off on their adventures with a smile. I think it actually made us all cry harder in that moment, to see Lejeune, even in that final moment, being the same sweet dragonborn we always knew him to be. For another one of the characters, Ben, he left the party on his own accord. The player wanted a new character because Ben just didn't fit him or the party. But the way that his death was planned was that I knew that he had family that he didn't see very often, but he didn't have a lot of big accomplishments. He focused on his magic and everything like that. And for him, I had planned to focus in on his memories, the ones that he could grasp at. And for each time he struggled to grasp at this good memory or something that really brought him joy as he was making his death saves, he would have a reminder of the things he wanted. Ben's death was going to be a tragedy if we got there. A tragedy that hopefully the players would learn from to help them grow, that hopes and dreams can only be backburnered so often. I think that just as grief is individual from person to person, so should be how we handle death in D&D. So as you start to get to know your players and their characters, start thinking of how you want to handle each individual one of their death. Because in that moment, in that panic, in that, whether it is an oops, misbalancing, somebody making a bad choice, or just pure stupidity, if you don't have things planned, it may go very, very badly. But individualizing each unique character's death is honestly a step in and of itself to make sure that each player feels seen and understood. Passing just plainly by them or using the same cookie cutter method for every single character feels, well, unsatisfying. And sometimes you might even find a player to be hurt by the lack of empathy towards something that they have loved so deeply. When a player character dies in a serious long-term campaign, we kind of lose a piece of ourselves. It is like grieving a friend. So as a DM, I like to make sure that I treat that with all the respect I can in the world. Which brings us to step 3. How to grieve, how to assist your players in that, but most importantly, how to move on. To start, I know that I mentioned having a backup character earlier. I don't suggest, unless you are in a meat grinder or lighthearted campaign, that you ever ask your player to be just whipping out that backup character. That's not what that is there for. I personally always have my players take a 1 to 2 session break. Editor Jacqueline here. When I say players take a 1 to 2 session break, I'm talking about the players who have lost their characters. I do still continue to play for the rest of them to give them the time in character to grieve. This is not just for the player who lost their character to take that personal time to grieve and to process, but it is time for the other players and their characters to grieve and process. There is nothing more infuriating to me as a player to lose something so dear and be basically at this person's funeral, and the next runner-up just goes, "Hi, I'm joining your party now." That is not just going to be awkward and uncomfortable, but I kind of feel like it's pseudo-Pavloving them. They are right off the bat associating this character, this new bustling bright person, and whatever they are coming to the table with these negative big emotions. Even if subconsciously that's going to affect how they treat that other character. And for some, that can create a much more powerful bond, but unless the new character is a close family or friend of the previous one, most of the time it's just a little awkward. During that 1 to 2 session break, however long that looks for your table, I like to take that time to start planning the next character's entrance, but also encourage my players to write down their favorite memories of them, talk to them about those other characters, and to help them through that sadness so that it doesn't carry over into the new character. I also find if I can convince my player to do some of that work for me, I can kind of get a better idea of what their focus was in that character on a personal level. Usually after that little bit of a break, they might feel better. And some players may not be as attached or emotional. I'll still encourage them to take the break, but even if after encouragement, I'm not going to force them to. But I will ask them the same question I'd ask any other DM trying to rush in a backup character into a story-driven campaign. How exactly are you crashing this party's funeral, and why do you feel you will be in, good favor with that? Because even if there's not a formal funeral, that's what you're coming into. Now, if we back up a couple of steps, though, you may say, why do you want to know your player's investments into their dead character? Well, that is for step number 4, the remembrance. When you think of the saddest funerals, it's never the people who were really loved and remembered, the ones that had the most tears shed. It's the ones where no one shows up. Now, you may not be holding a real funeral in Dungeons and Dragons, but the remembrance is still there. A headstone is a nice statue in a city they saved. A beautiful urn is the enchanted necklace they left behind for their best friend in the party. There is a ceremony of sorts that I find still carries over into the game. And remembrance is the most important part to me. If you didn't already know your players' motives for their characters or the things that really mattered to them, take some time to dissect their accomplishments. Not just the big ones, but the small ones too. Little impacts tend to go a lot further than big ones at times. Make a list of what you feel are the most important things they did during their time in your world, and then run with how that would carry through and affect your world long after they were gone. Sometimes making a character matter the most doesn't even come from them actively playing, but after they're gone, seeing how important and special they were. I don't think that any player character should feel like they just were a catalyst for playing a game. I feel like they should really feel lived in. Not just like they were a blip on your world's radar, but something that mattered. Even if that is the player character that everybody hated, being the inspiration for a traveling salesman. And I would say how big of an impact they made should be dependent on the good choices that they made around them to impact the world. We're going to circle back to Lejeune here for a moment. I decided to take my world in its infancy and give it to my players to make it their own. And Lejeune was a good friend with one of the gods, so obviously his sacrifice, especially under those conditions, would have meant something. In his final moments before making the choice to stay on this island falling, he decided to run into a war combat zone, not to fight, not to battle, not to try to stop people, but he took his staff that had sunlight on it and he held it high. He put a huge target on his back to show that he was safety, and he ushered all of the survivors who were desperate and panicking and running around to him and to safety. And after the first couple of nat 20s on his journey to pick up as many survivors as he could, he got to the boats. He made sure they all got on, and he said, I'm going to go back in. And he rolled nat 20 after nat 20 after nat 20, and we were in shock. And he was using different dice because we were like, dude, like, we know you've played with these dice, but did you load them overnight? I even gave him one of my dice at one point because it was insane. And we were tearing up. It was emotional. He hadn't even decided he was going to stay yet, but it was so powerful. And I have a system in the world in its infancy right now where if you want to talk to a god, it is a religion check. They're very active in the world, especially if you are somebody like Lejeune, who's a personal friend of them. And he said to everybody, I'm gonna leave. And we as players, me as a DM, we said, what do you mean? What do you mean? You have to, what are you talking about? That's when we all started sobbing. And he said, you know what? I'll leave it up to my God. Our sweet boy Lejeron, he wasn't religious, honestly, just a bit of a beach bum monk. He was just so friendly, even the gods loved him. And we all took a deep breath and we were like, whew. Okay, well, he has to roll like a 5 or above to get a hold of his goddess, and she is going to be like, you idiot, you have bigger things to do. She was a goddess of the sun. She only wanted good. And in that moment, he rolled a nat 1. First nat 1 that he had rolled, period, and it was in that moment. And it's been a year. It's been over a year. It's been almost 2 years, and I still cry over this. We all do when it's brought up in detail, because God, when the dice do what dice want to do. And sometimes that's the most beautiful parts of this story is the parts you don't see coming. Something that powerful had to be rewarded with something just as powerful. So I designed paragons. In my world, paragons are demigods, not by birth, but by choice. They are individuals who have made such an impact on either the world or the gods that they are ascended into a Valhalla-like afterlife. They are saints to Catholicism. They are individuals who have made such an impact that some people go as far to pray to them, worship them, gain their power from them. Each individual god has their unique reasons why they might ascend somebody to be a paragon, but Lejeron would always be the protector of the innocent, the first child of the sun, and the first paragon. And where my players currently are in the timeline, it's simple talks of making an afterlife and little pieces of the gods trying to find a way to make that work. When they return to my table for future adventures way, way down the line, they're gonna see much bigger impacts of Lejeron. It's not just going to be a catalyst for Nico to have experienced my world, but Lejeron is a living, breathing entity. And that impact, as much as it was chosen by the dice, was a choice of my player to make sure that his character did everything he could to make that impact. And it's in how we handle those deaths and that remembrance uniquely that it continues to come back and still bring up so many emotions. And I think it's part of our job as a DM to help our players navigate that, but to hold on to those and to make sure we do right by them. It is still important to remember that it's not always the grand moments that make a character feel alive. And I hope that next time you lose a character, you might be able to take 1 or 2 things from this video to help navigate that and make it feel truly special. Because most of us love our characters. And even if you don't love them as much as we do, it's still not super cool to laugh at their wake. With all of that being said, death is never easy to deal with, be it real life or fictional. So if you guys have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments below. I try to answer as many as I can whenever I have the availability. And if you think that I might be going over the top with how I handle death, I mean, it doesn't take that much effort really to be kind and considerate of others, especially the people who are coming to your table investing time in you. As much as it is hard sometimes to find a DM and not everybody wants to take on that role, responsibility, or effort, your players are still showing up to invest their time, energy, and effort into your world. And if you are asking them to be respectful of and be invested in your world and the things that you put effort into, it is just as important to be respectful and invested into the work that they put into their characters. Always thank your players for coming and investing in you too. I am terrible with serious videos and goodbyes, so take care, stay well, and I will see you in the next one. On the topic of death, crackers showed up in my 3rd story apartment a couple of days before my father passed away. He came with me to hospice. He came with me to some of the celebrations of life, and he has been absolutely inseparable for me ever since. I was terrified of cats at the time, but now we have the little man, and it has been 10 years as of June that he has been with me. So he an old man, and the vet still thinks he's 4 years old. And I'm like, he was grown and 4 years old when I got him. They're like, oh, well, whoever you rescued him from lied to you about his age. And I'm like, yeah, it's me. I'm the one who's had him for 10 years. So since he's basically immortal, he's either a skinwalker or familiar. And I don't know how I feel about having a skinwalker in my house. So we're going to call him my familiar. Say bye, guys.